So we're going to be talking about FAIR computational workflows. I'm from Elixir, the research infrastructure for life science data in Europe, which is an enormous research infrastructure covering 23 different countries and 220 organizations, many of which are using workflows. And Dan is god of FAIR software. So our scope is FAIR. So what is FAIR? Just to remind you, in case you've been under a rock and you didn't know what FAIR was, it's findable, interoperable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And this gives a very nice kind of summary what that means. It comes down to the development of machine processable metadata, the use of persistent identifiers, the cataloging and indexing of, in this particular case, this of the data, clear access protocols, so you can access the metadata and ideally the data, and reusability from the point of view of metadata standards, machine accessible usage licenses, and machine accessible provenance. So this kind of summarizes what FAIR is from the data perspective. And this kind of started off back in about 2014, actually. Now, the scope of our particular workshop is to think about FAIR software instead. So from the FAIR workflow point of view, you can think about workflows if you think about them as descriptions. We have specifications, we often have DSLs, specific workflow language expressions that are then executed by an engine of some sort. Common workflow language is an example of that. And you can think of those as data-like objects that you can have metadata with, associated DOIs with, and so on, plus associated objects with those workflows, for example, test data and parameter files and so on. One can think about those from the point of view of FAIR data principles. But actually what we're going to focus on, particularly in this workshop, is the fact that workflows are in fact software objects. So we have issues to do with reproducibility and usability and quality and maturity and so on. And recently, the FAIR for Research software principles have been published and announced. So these apply both to the workflows, but also to the workflow management systems. So we have, in fact, two major publications that have been produced. The first is this, as I said, introducing the FAIR principles for research software, which then identifies what's the differences associated with software as opposed to the principles with data. We've also had a recent publication around best practices for research software registries and repositories. And Danny, who is the lead author, is on the call. So we're privileged to have him on the call as well to help us. So what's the state of the art at the moment with FAIR? Well, if we were trying to FAIR workflows, if we were trying to find and access workflows, here are all the different places that we can find them. We can find them in community repositories, and I've used bio ones because that's where I come from, or you find them on GitHub, or you find them by Googling, or you find them in publications, in supplementary materials, or they're deposited in Zenodo as a block, or they're in community platforms like Nextflow Tower or Galaxy, or they're in registries. And there's two particular registries that are really kind of in the bio world anyway, leading the way: Workflow Hub and DocStore. So the state of the art we have with FAIR workflows is, at the moment, this is a subset of the state of the art, the notion of registries and repositories. So we've got these registries where we have to also think about curation best practice. They're all pretty well Git enabled. We have metadata frameworks in order to be able to say, how do we describe workflows, and what is the metadata we need with workflows, because FAIR is all about metadata. So we have frameworks for giving canonical descriptions to workflows, like common workflow language, typing the inputs and outputs of workflows so that we might be able to put them together, interoperate the components, the compositionality aspects of a workflow. For example, the EDAM ontology. How do we describe workflows so we can register them and find them and express what they're about? And we in our world use bioschemas for that, which is a variation of schemas. And also, how do we package metadata? So how do we package all the files associated with a workflow and associated objects? And in our world, we use Research Object Crate, RO Crate, for that. And then we have a whole bunch of FAIR support services for benchmarking, for monitoring the continued life and health of a workflow, for being able to execute multiple workflows different kinds of languages, but with a common execution platform using APIs. For example, the GA for GH, WES, and TRS APIs. So in Europe, we're building this ecosystem of fair workflow services. And in this confusogram, this shows you the kind of ecosystem that we're building. And on the right is a fairly elaborate logo cloud of all the different projects associated with the European Open Science Cloud, which is a massive investment in Europe, all using this ecosystem of fair workflow services. And finally, as part of the state of the art, there's also a big move towards communities curating their own reference workflows. For example, NF Core is a curated collection of workflows using Nextflow from the bioinformatics community, or building validated and tested workflow blocks. So this is a kind of reusability first design approach. So for example, the BioExcel project, which does work to do with biomolecular simulation, has wrapped a whole bunch of workflows and tools so that they can be used in multiple different workflow systems in a platform independent way and in a clean way, so that we can reuse components in multiple environments. And that kind of talks to fair unit testing and also the cost, technical debt and refactoring associated with that activity. It also requires standardized IO formats and things like good quality, clean interfaces, and being able to understand license combinations and so on. And then finally, in this state-of-the-art piece, you can see there's a beginning to be a kind of whole community of publications in this area around making your software tool workflow ready, around reusability first, around what does it mean to make fair workflows. And even more noise. So this is basically saying there's a lot of activity. Actually, I'll be very interested to point out if anybody has heard of the canonical workflow framework for research, which is a big activity as well in Europe, which is moving towards the development of canonical workflows in communities. So our challenges are, what are our recommendations for these fair workflow registries and repositories? So we want to be able to synthesize and distill and apply many of the recommendations, particularly from these two papers that have just been published around fair software and around what is the 9 best practices for software registries, and to then encourage the adoption of those recommendations. What are the minimum metadata requirements we need for our workflows? What is the common API for federated search over these different registries and repositories? What is then with workflow management systems, what do we need to build into workflow management systems so that they become more fair? I.e., how do we surface metadata from those workflow management systems? How can we harvest it? Are there standardized mechanisms for expressing the workflow inputs, which we discussed yesterday as a major issue? What does it mean to have a good workflow? What is a reusability first workflow? What is good documentation? What is needed to build these workflow libraries that people are doing? And how do we validate and verify these workflows? And then also another question we've been asked by journals who are looking to use these workflow registries for their recommended resources for publications that are using workflows. Well, what is a good workflow? How do you actually decide what is a peer-reviewed high-quality workflow? And that's an interesting question. So the breakout discussion will split into 2 parts. The first will be on recommendations for fair workflow repositories and registries. Dan will present the FAIR principles for software, and the other Danny, Danny will present the 9 best practices for a workflow repository and registry. And then in the second half, we'll then try to identify what are the top 3 things that we really need to do and recommend with workflow management systems in order to be able to have built-in FAIR into the workflow management system. Did you want to have any other comments, Dan?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, as Carole said, we're really thinking about this in terms of the ecosystem, and in particularly, we want to think about these 2 different places in the ecosystem that we can have impact in the places where workflows are stored and the tools that actually run the workflows. And so we're we're going to focus on those two areas in terms of things that we can recommend to do.